I'm XPLovecat, and welcome to the third video in my series of being a new GM or keeper. So you've started your journey on running a tabletop RPG for you and your friends. You've chosen a system, you've read through the rules, and you have a base understanding of the game. Now it's time to pick what the content of your first session is going to be. And in most cases, this is going to be a pre-made scenario. I'm going to be giving some tips on what to look out for in a pre-made scenario, how to choose one, and how to prep for it. And if you've chosen to play Call of Cthulhu, stick around to the end and I will give some specific advice on which scenario to run for your first session. So you're a first-time game master and you're all hyped up. You've chosen your system, you've got friends to play with, and your first session is scheduled for this Saturday. You've prepped the room, you've got snacks, sharpened pencils, you're good to go. Except for the fact that you have to decide what you're actually going to play. My first tip for preparing what to play is to choose a pre-made scenario. Now, the really awesome thing about tabletop RPGs is there's room for a ton of creativity, which means a lot of times game masters create their own scenarios for their players to run through. I think this is awesome, and I would definitely encourage this at some point throughout your GMing life. But for your first session, I think it's great to start with a pre-made scenario for a few different reasons. First of all, running a pre-made scenario gives you an idea of how the system is intended to be played. So oftentimes it will have key roles or the general structure of how the system flows throughout the pre-made scenario. In addition, it makes you familiar with the general structure of a scenario. Now, just like writing a song or writing a story, there is a general arc or way that we get our players from point A to B, and this will give you some exposure to what that structure should look like if you ever decide to make your own scenario. And it also gets rid of some variables. When you're GMing for the first time, you're just trying to figure out kind of how to navigate the table and try to find your specific style. You don't want the added pressure of making a scenario that's super awesome and fun for your players. You can just sit down and focus on making this a fun time for everyone and kind of learning your general GMing style. So how do you go about choosing a scenario to play for the first time? I have a couple criteria to go through, and this is pretty limiting at first, but your world really expands after you play your first scenario. So this is really only for the first 1 or 2 times that you would play that you would focus on this criteria. So first, you should look out for any introductory levels. Most systems either offer a starter pack or recommendation on what scenarios you should run first. And the reason why they do that is it usually has some specific tips for the GM or ways that you can easily get your players from one point to the next within the scenario. You should also make sure that this is a one-shot. And what I mean by that is you can either have a one-shot scenario or a campaign. Campaign usually lasts over several different sessions, up to months at a time, and is a flowing story between each of those sessions. And a one-shot usually is completed within 3 to 4 hours and contains the entire story within that time frame. You're going to want to look out for this because it's a little bit easier to maintain, to plan for, and for everyone at the table to digest. The other thing I like to do with first-time scenarios is look for a confined space. So there might be some scenarios in which it's open world and your players can go anywhere they want. They can go to the bar, they can go to the grocery store, they can go to the hospital, they can go wherever they want. I like to confine the space a little bit because it's easier for the GM to control. So a good example would be a dungeon or an island or even a small town. Just something where you know exactly the different options for the players in that area and you can plan a little bit for what might happen at those different locations. And the last thing to look out for is balance within the scenario. So what I mean by that is a little bit of investigation and a little bit of combat, usually about equivalent parts of both. Now this will obviously change based on the system you are playing, but I always think it's good to have a balance within these scenarios so that your players can experience both things and see what your group likes the best. Now most pre-made scenarios will already be set up this way, but it's good to look out for this. Alright, so you've chosen your pre-made. Now what? First things first, you should expect to spend about 2 to 4 hours of planning time prior to your session. Now, the amount of time that game masters use to prepare a scenario is extremely variable and is dependent upon complexity and GMing style. But for your first time, you're probably going to spend about 2 to 4 hours prepping for your first session. So what is the game plan for planning, and what should you be looking out for? Well, the first thing is to read the scenario. Now I'm going to offer a little bit of advice on how exactly you should do this. I usually like to read the beginning of the scenario and the end of the scenario, so you know where your players start and where they're supposed to end up. And then you can go back and see what the logical way of your players getting from point A to point B is. Now, after this initial read, take a minute to let it soak in, and also mentally prepare yourself for the fact that your players will not do exactly what is in the book. Hey, remember when we read about that guy? His name was Fred or something? Yeah, I think he's probably the next stop. And he lives in Norway, so we should definitely go there next. Are you guys sure you want to go there next? You're in New Hampshire. Yeah, I'm sure. We definitely have to track down this author to find out what to do next. You know you only have like one clue pointing to this, right? Yeah, all the evidence. Naturally, everyone thinks really differently, and so there's a ton of different ways that RPGs can go, and it's not going to always be exactly how it's written out in the scenario. Now, this is what makes RPGs so much fun, is because people can be really creative, and you never really know what's going to happen, not even as the game master. But the important thing to know is, where do you start, where do you end, and what are the key points that get you to that ending? Everything else is going to look a little bit different from session to session. Now, after you've let that first read settle, I recommend reading through the whole scenario one more time, and this time taking notes. There's a bunch of different ways you can take notes, obviously, but I prefer to go electronic. And specifically during sessions, I usually keep my phone or my tablet next to me so I can look at notes when I need to. I like to use the app OneNote, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a run through of how to use it and what it looks like when I'm done writing some notes in it. This is the application OneNote, which I use as a game master to stay organized and keep track of some of the things that I might forget while playing in a session. So the first thing I want to do is add a notebook, which is down here. And I'm just going to title this for now GM Notes, but really it should be any of the title of your scenario so you can keep track of the different things that you're writing in your notes. I'm going to go ahead and create that. Now, the two main things in OneNote is you can add sections and pages. So for the different sections, I actually don't normally use this for a specific one-shot scenario, but I will use them if I'm doing a more long-form campaign. So I'm going to pretend like I'm doing a campaign just so you can see both features. I would generally title a section by either the name of the different locations or any specific major events that would happen within the campaign. So for this one, I'm going to pretend like we are having different locations. And I'm going to create just a couple of different sections here for these locations. All right, then next I'm going to go into each of these sections and do a similar format within each of the different locations. I'm going to use these pages. So the first page is going to be setting. Now, I don't go crazy in depth here, but I do want to make a couple points about things that I want to remember to help set the mood and really be descriptive about what kind of environment the players are going to play in. So for example, we have England here. A couple things that I might be thinking about that I want to portray is that there's a fog issue in the city, so London fog. And the other thing I might point out is that there's a weird mix of cars and bicycles. You know, it's the 1920s, so they're just getting into the invention of the car. And I want to make sure to point that out. So again, this isn't crazy in depth, but it is just a nice note for me to remember moving forward. The next page that I'm going to make is measure NPCs. So this is not going to be every single character, but it is going to be the main characters that the story revolves around. Let's pretend I have an NPC. Her name is Susie. And I like to write down what page I find her on in the scenario, so in case I have to reference that, I can quickly go and do that. So I find her on page 11, let's say, and I like to write about the key things about Susie. So what role does she play in the scenario? What kind of defining characteristics does she have that I can remember to portray during my session? So she's a priest's daughter, and let's say she also loves dolls. That's something that brings her to life, brings her character a bit to life. And when I'm playing her, I have to remember that I want to play her with a high voice and that she's always excited. Let's just pretend she's excited all the time. So next time my characters encounter Susie, I remember that I have to play her like this, and she's really excited and she loves her dolly so much. The next page I'm going to add here are key clues. These are the main clues that the players should find to be able to get them from point A to point B. So these usually are things that can be moved from different locations or can be found in multiple different ways, so that you have the flexibility to go with how your players are following the scenario, but you know that they have to encounter these clues at some point. So for example, we have to find the priest's journal. And I'm also going to write what page number I find this on, again, so I can reference it if need be. I also want to write a brief description of why this clue is so important, so I can remember next time that my players run into it. Let's say this has key clues on how to stop the ritual. And I'll continue to do that for all of the clues in the scenario that I'm playing. The final page I like to include is in session notes. So normally I wouldn't put anything in here when I'm planning for my scenario. However, when I'm playing, I like to make notes of things that happen so that I can remember them later on. Let's just say one of the player characters, his name is Kevin, he goes into a shop and steals a book. He doesn't get caught right away, but the shopkeep ends up finding out that he does steal it and calls the cops on him. So I'm going to write a note to myself so I can remember later in the scenario to maybe send the cops after him, and that'll be another obstacle that they have to go through. This page is particularly important for campaigns. Since they're longer form, it's pretty easy to forget what happens from session to session, so it's a great reminder to come back and read through this stuff so your players can have consequences for the actions that they take within the campaign. Now, I would do something similar for each of these locations and have those same pages. And the final thing that I would do, particularly for a campaign, not necessarily for a one-shot, is I would add an additional section and call it reminders. I would use this purely as a GM to remember to do certain things that I have to complete outside of our regular session. An example of this would be if you have to create something, either an artifact or a spell for your characters to get them moving forward. The other thing I like to do in my reminders is note where we left off in the campaign. So that next time, if it's been a month or so since your last session, you can go and reference this and know exactly where you guys left off. So maybe your player characters just finished breaking into a hotel and it's Thursday night. So some campaigns you will have to keep track of time, and this is a great place to make sure you're being consistent with that timeline. So there you go. There's a brief explanation of how I take my notes and stay organized as a game master. So notes are really useful in a lot of different ways. One, it can help you remember the content a little bit better, but also it can help you as a backup if you do forget something and you need to look it up during the session. And in addition, if you're preparing days or even weeks in advance, they're there for you when you need them during your session. Great. Now the last step is to relax, prepare to have a little bit of fun. No, it's not going to go the way exactly that you expect, but that's okay. It's going to be a ton of fun, and the more you practice, the better you're going to get at it. All right, my Call of Cthulhu friends, your time is now. This is going to be specifically for the Call of Cthulhu RPG and what starter scenario I recommend you playing for your first session. Now, if you've done any sort of research for the system or know anything about Call of Cthulhu, you probably will not be surprised at all with the answer that I give you for your first session. It's a classic, it's free, and it's a great guide for both players and keepers getting a great introduction to the system. Now it comes free with the quick start rules and it's called The Haunting. I will link the rules in the description below if you'd like to check it out. Now the general concept is investigators are hired to investigate a supposedly haunted house. The owner of the house wants to sell it and just wants a clean bill of health. No problem. Now this is meant to be played in a single session and originally written in the 1920s. However, it can be adapted to really any time frame that you're wanting to play because it's just a house. The scenario starts out with giving players 3 very clear options of what they can investigate. Now, I really like this for your first scenario because people might not be used to having to investigate as much, and so it gives you very clearly, okay, these are things I should really be going to every time that an investigation of this sort starts out. But this does kind of lead into my next point, which is that the scenario is extremely hand-holdy. So if you've ever heard the term railroad, which is basically you keep your players on a specific track and you don't let them deviate, that's kind of what this scenario is like. And the reason why it's like that is because it's intended for someone who has not been a keeper before. So you're gonna feel like you might not have a ton of different options to sway, but honestly, it's really helpful because then you don't have so much to worry about during your first session. They have some really great keeper's notes throughout the scenario, like pushing rolls and how combat should work. Overall, I think this scenario does a really good job of highlighting what a traditional Call of Cthulhu experience is intended to be like. It's really helpful for the keeper as it gives little hints and notes about how you should run the scenario and reminders for those who might not remember all the rules right away. So strap in and join the thousands of people who have played this scenario before you. It's almost a rite of passage at this point that if you're playing Call of Cthulhu, you've played The Haunting before. And my last point is don't entirely judge the system on this one scenario just because it is so handholdy. I would definitely recommend trying a couple sessions out, and with more time, you're going to get better as a keeper, and that might be more enjoyable for your players as well. So good luck, and I hope this helps you run your first session as either a game master or a keeper. And make sure to join me next time when I talk more about prepping the table, what research you need to do, and all the way through running your first session. Thank you for watching. Bye.